Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Nargis Kasyanova, and I'm a senior fellow at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Thank you for joining our event today, co-organized together with the Minda D. Ginsburg Center for European Studies here at Harvard. And we're also grateful to the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies for helping us advertise it. Today, we're hosting a book talk and a discussion, and the book is Daniel Marquis' China's Western Horizon, Beijing and the New Geopolitics of Eurasia, in which he describes and analyzes China's engagement in South Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East. It is a great book, and to those who haven't read it yet, I highly recommend to read it. We're very happy to have the author with us, Dr. Daniel Marquis, and we are also very happy to have Dr. Andrew Small with us, who will discuss the book and provide an overview of the European perspective on China's engagement in Eurasia. I will do proper introduction of speakers, but first I want to give the floor to Vasilis Koutifaris, who is director at the Center for European Studies. Please,
Thank you, Nargis. Thank you, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. On behalf of the Center for European Studies, I am particularly excited for this discussion because a lot of our students have recently asked for us to engage more with our fellow regional centers and highlight China and the European relations and US policy on China more. And second, particularly in this era of the pandemic crisis, I think this is a great opportunity for all of us to bring people together on this platform. I'm very happy Andrew is joining us from Berlin and Dan is joining us from Washington, D.C. And a lot of our students actually are planning and hoping to spend next summer either overseas in Europe or in Washington, D.C. at a more policy relevant internship. So thank you so much. And mostly thank you to Davis Center for organizing all of this.
Thank you so much, Vasilis. So, okay, let me introduce our speakers today, and then we'll go to the presentations, to the meat of the meeting. So Daniel Marquis is a senior research professor at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies, where he also serves as the academic director of the Global Policy Program. From 2007 to 2015, he was a senior fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations. From 2003 to 2007, he held the South Asia portfolio on the Secretary's policy planning staff at the US Department of State. Prior to that, he taught at the Department of Politics at Princeton University, where he also served as executive director of the Research Program in International Security. And before that, I'm happy to note that he was a postdoc fellow at Harvard's Olin Institute for Strategic Studies. So in a sense, I think this book was meant to happen. Our second speaker, our discussant, is Andrew Small, who is a senior transatlantic fellow with German Marshall Fund's Asia program, which he established in 2006. His research focuses on US-China relations, Europe-China relations, Chinese policy in South Asia, and broader developments in China's foreign and economic policy. He was based in GMF's Brussels office for 5 years and worked before as the director of the Foreign Policy Center's Beijing office, as a visiting fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and as an ESU scholar in the office of Senator Edward M. Kennedy. So, welcome, gentlemen. We're very happy you joined us. And, the mic is yours then.
Great. Thank you, Nargis. Thanks to you, to the Davis Center, to the Center for European Studies, to Vasilis. It's great to be able to join all of you. And thanks to Andrew for coming along, and a preliminary thanks also to Andrew for his help along the way as I was writing the book, because he was one of the people who read bits and pieces of it, and sometimes more than that. And his work has informed my own. So it's a great pleasure to be able to join with him on this panel. Now, China's Western Horizon, this book, really does have origins, not surprisingly, in my work on South Asia, which is a bit further afield from the focus of the Davis Center or with the Center of European Studies. But that's where I started. And it really began as a project that had to do with my thinking about the evolution and trajectory of China's role in its relations, especially with Pakistan, but then onward into how that would affect Pakistan's relations with India, and how all of that played into the emerging global competition, geopolitical competition between the United States and China. And that I saw as a critical development in South Asia, and one that at least a decade ago, when I began thinking about this, was underappreciated as something that would really be formative. And so as I began that process, that eventually matured into this book. The book does still open with a story from Pakistan, a story from the port of Gwadar along the Arabian Sea that some of your viewers may be less familiar with, but it's a new port project. And I thought the story was really illustrative of some things that I began to see in other cases as well. Now, Gwadar Port, for those of us who have even heard of it at all, tends to be identified as a part of a broader string of pearls of places in the world that China, Beijing, has identified as strategic nodes that it might use for its military or other purposes throughout the Indo-Pacific. But the reality of the story, and this is why I think it's so important, is that it actually reflects a high degree of local agency. That is, the significance and importance of what is happening on the ground in other states. This is not just a story of Beijing looking out into the world, seeing a map, and then identifying points on that map where it would want to project its influence. It is in fact a story of the leader at the time, in around 2000, the year 2000, of President Musharraf asking Beijing for assistance to build out this port, and finding that the Chinese were surprised and a bit confused by his request, but persisting in this request to the point that the Chinese ultimately said that they would do so. And Musharraf, Pakistan's leader, military leader, and at the time the president, believed that this port would help Pakistan in its long-standing competition with India. So he had a strategic rationale in mind. The port, the story doesn't end there. The port suffered over its first decade or so, in part for lack of interest, commercial interest, but also because it was being located in a very difficult part of Pakistan, a part of Pakistan with a contested territory with an active separatist and terrorist movement, Baloch nationalists, who really saw this port as running against their own local interests, and who have actively worked to undermine such projects in the past. And so that local reality of politics, of political economy, of who wins and who loses from any given project was something that really jumped out from this story of Gwadar. But eventually this port has come into being, although it seems less significant than some might make it out to be, in part because China has the resources and the capacity, the wherewithal to make such projects work. That is, China's rising wealth and power, when given the opportunity, will fill open spaces throughout its neighborhood. And Gwadar is an example of that, of what I would describe more as Chinese opportunism, driven or made possible by local realities, than by a kind of a strategic agenda born, hatched, and delivered and implemented out of Beijing directly. So it's this interactive quality of China's relations with its local neighbors that I set out to explore in this book. And what I found is that the story, in a sense, repeats itself, although the details are quite different across different states, as you would expect. And what we see is that local interests, local ambitions, local politics and economics matter a great deal to defining the contours of what will happen as Chinese influence, Chinese economic interests first and foremost, but then political and security interests begin to enter these societies. So if you take one thing away from this talk or from my book in general, it would simply be that China does not act in a vacuum, and that to focus on purely or primarily even on what Beijing wants in the world will give you both an incomplete and sometimes, I think, inaccurate picture of what is likely to happen in its neighborhood. So in the book, I've raised a number of other points as well. I also wish to try to help my primary audience, which is American readers, better appreciate the connections and interconnections that span across continental Eurasia, the ways in which what is happening in Kazakhstan or what is happening in Pakistan, what is happening in Iran are similar, and how this region, which really rightly ought to be considered as a mega region in and of itself, but which is too often divided up into subregions by American policymakers and American thinkers in ways that make us lose track of how one thing can affect the next, and how these areas are increasingly knitted up, both in physical sense in terms of infrastructure and transportation and so on, but also in a strategic sense because they're all being affected by similar dynamics in terms of China's rise. So I wanted to make that clear. I also spend a fair amount of the book just talking about what China is doing in the region and outlining what China is up to, because although that's not the only story, it's an important part of the story. And then I wrap up the book with some suggestions about what the United States itself might do in response to China. But if I can circle back now just to the real focus of this book, it is on agency, on the agency of the actors, of Eurasian actors themselves. And in the main cases of the book, I outline how that unfolds first in South Asia, this area of my greatest interest prior to writing this book, but then also in Central Asia, where I focus principally on Kazakhstan, but also on the Russia, China, Kazakhstan relationship, and then onward into the Middle East, which I think is now an increasingly hot area of exploration for how China is involved in the Middle East, but has been less well appreciated even in the recent past. And I try to sketch out this story in a kind of a two-part way, two levels of analysis, you might say. The first set of questions that I look at are what's happening at the domestic level, what's happening on the home front, what's happening in each one of these countries. And again, I focus principally on Pakistan, Kazakhstan, and Iran, partly because these are important countries in and of themselves, geographically, economically, or strategically, but also because China has put a fair amount of emphasis on these three countries. And so what I look at, to make it very simple, make a complicated story as simple as possible, is who is winning, who is losing, who is winning more, and who is winning less, in a sense, from China's increasing involvement. So I ask questions about how, say, elites within Kazakhstan, who have been in a position of political and economic power now for decades, how they, in the period after the global financial crisis, really latched onto China as, to put it bluntly, a savior, an economic bailout scheme that enabled them both to retain their economic interests and their political power in ways that might otherwise have been much more difficult. So they are the clear winners, in a sense, from China's increasing involvement in the region. But I also look at political cleavages that may be opening up within some of these societies. So I mentioned this story of Gwadar Port and the Baloch separatists. This is just one example of how different groups, some groups see themselves as clear losers within society, and China's involvement can exacerbate the tensions within these societies, make these cleavages actually worse rather than better. It is not the case that Chinese investment into a country naturally makes everyone wealthier and happier and get along better or have their politics be less contentious. In fact, it can bring about more contention in politics. And then the last piece at the local level that I really look at is how local leaders may be using China to help them suppress opposition forces, to help them actually promote anti-democratic, illiberal policies. So here the example of Iran's regime, which is increasingly using Chinese technology to surveil and censor and control its population so that they have less meaningful access to the global internet in ways that would enable opposition mobilization to take place. So I look at all of these features and try to see how they add up. The second part of the analysis really is the regional dynamic. And here I look at how Eurasian states are increasingly seeing China as a potential partner to help them deal with age-old, or at least decades-old, contentious politics with their neighbors. And so here, in a nutshell, I look at South Asia, about the contentious relations between Pakistan and India, how Pakistan sees China as a benefactor that will help it balance India, how India is increasingly wary, not just about China in and of itself, but about China as a patron to Pakistan, and how that can be disruptive and destabilizing. In Central Asia, I focus more on the China-Russia relationship and the potential that they're, while they are now working well together and certainly want the world to believe that they can have a division of labor in Central Asia, where Russia is the sword or the gun, China is the purse, that is the economic provider, and they can happily coordinate in that way. There are questions about underlying tensions and differences and pride of place, prestige, and who's really in charge in the region. These things will be contentious. And in the Middle East, I play out how Iran is contending with Saudi Arabia, and also sees China as useful in its ongoing problems with the United States in particular, and trying to ward off or buffer itself from US pressure. Now, I want to wrap up here, but obviously these issues become very complicated very quickly. And partially that is what I am trying to argue. This is not a simple story of China coming into a political vacuum, overwhelming all contenders and placing its imperial stamp on a region. This is a much more dynamic and evolving story in which each of the local actors have a role to play. But by and large, from a US perspective, I think we should be concerned. The economic story is mixed, but there is the potential for China to bring about what some are describing as lock-in of Chinese technologies, of Chinese standards, of Chinese business relations that would make it very hard in this broader region for the United States or other countries for their companies to compete on a level playing field. On the political front, I've already observed that this Chinese assistance to authoritarian leaders in the region is something that certainly I and many others in the United States will be increasingly worried about. And even on the security front, we're seeing China establish liaison relationships, defense sales partnerships, and other possibilities for extending its military reach across this vast swath of territory that will, of course, make the United States nervous, at least in the long run, about what that will mean for China's military power projection capability up to Europe's doorstep. I'll leave it here, but I will say nothing is set in stone about how these dynamics will unfold. But I think there's little reason to expect that China's increasing involvement will play to the advantage of the types of political or economic reforms that the United States has traditionally stood for. That it may exacerbate local and regional conflict in ways that are worrisome. And there is still the potential for China to expand its, not just its economic footprint, but its political influence and its military influence in ways that can turn China from an East Asian state, a great power nonetheless, to a global superpower in ways that will have broader implications for the world. So Nargis, thanks again. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Dan. Well, it's a very rich book, and I have like maybe 100 post-its inside the book, and I really appreciated your focus on the agency, on all these divisions, and the winners, losers, and cleavages emerging. And I've also very much appreciated the connections and interconnections that you're exploring, and actually. That was the reason why we decided to do it with Vasilis. We thought it would be really nice to combine our efforts and us doing Eurasia and his center doing European studies. How all these things are linked, and they are so incredibly linked. Okay, but we have an official discussant. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Nargis, and thanks, Vasilis, for the chance to join this. And thanks to Dan too. Not only have I benefited from his work in this area, but also from his advice on the actual book process itself. So glad to be able to join his process this time for a portion of it. So in my comments, I'm going to cover two issues, kind of jumping off from Dan's book: Europe as player and Europe as playing field. The first part of this is basically to jump off the final chapter of Dan's book, which looks at the strategic options for the United States in responding to China's role in Eurasia, and run that through a European policy prism. How far the two sides, the US and the EU, think alike and align in dealing with this. The second part of this is, if Dan had written an additional chapter before that last one and applied the same methodology that he does for all of these other regions to the furthest end of the Eurasian landmass, what would that analysis look like? I'm going to begin with that second part, partly because the second part conditions the first. I think European views on policy options have been conditioned by the fact that Europe itself is the subject of the same initiatives, most obviously the Belt and Road, as many of the regions in the book. And I would say, if anything, that Europe started thinking hard about this question at least 2 years before the US did, because they were confronted with some concrete decisions on home turf, while in DC, the deliberations in that first phase, 2015, 2016, when I was following it there closely, were still a bit more distant. Most US policymakers still viewed China overwhelmingly through an Asia-Pacific lens, and saw some of these Eurasian and BRI issues in kind of a lower tier. One of the points that really informs Dan's whole book, as he's reiterated in his presentation, is something that I kind of want to quote again, which is, to succeed, American policy and intelligence analysts need to devote at least as much attention to figuring out how Eurasians perceive and deal with China as they do to tracking Chinese initiatives in their region. At present, this is not the case. Now, although things have improved somewhat in the period since Dan's manuscript was finished, I think there's been a problem with some of the US analysis on China in Europe too, for similar reasons. I think there's still often a tendency to focus on what China is doing and Chinese intentions rather than the context in which it's operating. As Dan noted also in the book, knowing what China wants or even what China is attempting to do is an essential starting point, but an insufficient one. Let me give you a couple of European examples. One of the biggest factors differentiating how Chinese investments in Europe are likely to look in the next 5 years versus how they looked through the Eurozone crisis is essentially how the Northern European states, Germany, where I am at the moment, in particular, have dealt with the Southern European ones. The most sizable Chinese acquisitions of sensitive infrastructure in Europe predate the Belt and Road, and came about during the kind of desperate fire sales in Greece and Portugal at the peak of the Eurozone crisis. Italian approaches to China more recently, to take another example, have all been significantly conditioned by its budget situation and some of the political games playing with Brussels around that issue. And the same, to pull it through to the COVID crisis, was also true, where the aim from certain Italian politicians, not all, but some certainly, in highlighting China's provision of medical supplies, was mostly to shame other European countries into giving more support. The huge deal that was reached on the recovery package and the EU budget is, I think, likely to do more politically and to an extent economically as well to prevent a repeat of the early 2010s, the Chinese acquisition spree that we saw then, than any other development. And yet we've had about 50 times as much China-related analysis directed, even the most trivial remarks by comparison, relatively disempowered EU representative for foreign policy as we have on these kind of deep infrastructural questions in Europe. And I think the same goes in Central Europe as well. There was a lot of analysis, and there is still a fair bit of analysis about how Chinese investments and Chinese finance were giving it leverage in Central Europe, when in fact, often China was itself being used as leverage by some of these countries in their other intra-European political battles. Hungary, of course, being the most obvious example of that. While the actual scale of Chinese financing in play was and essentially remains quite small by comparison with Western Europe, and certainly small by comparison with the sort of resources that are available from the EU itself. And I think all of this has particularly important implications for this Europe is divided on China analysis, which we spend so much time on. I think, in fact, relative to other issues, although there are certainly different views on China in Europe, it's actually not, I think, as fiercely divisive a subject as many others. Europe has been divided on other issues very significantly, and at points China plays into that, what Dan in his presentation just described as, I think, something like opportunism informed by local conditions, or is instrumentalized by European political actors in some of these other more consequential fights. But in practice, when there are really important China-related policy decisions, it's been, in fact, much easier to reach agreement on some of these things that you might think. And we can discuss this in the Q&A as well. And that's really just to touch a couple of these kind of internal EU, north-south, east-west dynamics without even going into the situation within European states, which is to say, generally speaking, I think applying Dan's approach to Europe as well will, in my view, more often yield kind of accurately weighed accounts of what's going on there. And I found it, just going back to the manuscript in the last few days, very refreshing to come back and read analysis that treats the context in each of these regions with due weight. Now, there has, aside from this, been a major rethink on China in Europe in recent years too, to the extent that I would say mainstream European political views on China are now not so far, at least analytically, far away from the more, at least moderate end of the US mainstream views, even if it's not, I think, in the same place as some of the kind of harder edged positions that some parts of the Trump administration have got to. Now, there's a number of factors that have driven this, including the particular brand of Xi's modern domestic authoritarianism and international assertiveness, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and so on. But I think the chief factor has been economic, with the most critical actors being, in many ways, the European business community. And it was striking that it was Germany's BDI, the section of European industry that's benefited most from China's economic growth in the last decade, that actually came up with this concept of the systemic competitor that became systemic rival when it morphed into EU policy last year. And I think what's important about the systemic thinking is that it treats all of the factors in play as being intertwined. Xi's ideological and security agenda at home, all the kind of non-market practices, subsidies for Chinese actors, and all the other challenges facing European firms in China itself, higher and higher levels of the value chain, these questions around the weaponization of China's market and supply chain position, and then the extension of these practices to third markets, including in the risks that Dan's book covers, from procurement issues to, as he was kind of wrapping up his remarks, talking about this attempt to push Chinese standards and Chinese technology, and all of the political and commercial implications for the global landscape that follow from it, which I think European industry has decided it cannot really comfortably live with anymore. And the policy response to this is then twofold. One element is defensive. It's about rebalancing the asymmetry in the relative openness of Europe and China, including through trade measures, investment screening, the use of competition policy to take on Chinese subsidies, or this new anti-coercion tool that's under debate. But the other part, kind of pivoting back to the book, is offensive. It's on the one hand going after Chinese activities in precisely these markets, something that the EU has actually done and that the US has not actually fully attempted yet, is to start targeting Chinese BRI subsidies in third countries, Egypt being the big test case there, even if on the European side it's framed around rules and the level playing field rather than sort of counter-China steps. On the other hand, it does involve thinking about how to make alternative economic offers to countries. Now, I would say in general, the defensive piece for Europe has moved forward quite quickly in the last year or so, the offensive side more slowly. There's not yet a good, clear and strategically directed connectivity offer to countries from Europe that represents a clear BRI alternative, despite the fact that when it comes to the actual resources at Europe's disposal, aid money, outbound investment finance, there are places where it absolutely dwarfs what China is doing. And here, in that sense, I think the US and Europe have been to some extent in the same boat. They do actually have the financial power in theory, individually and certainly collectively, but their systems have not necessarily been well placed to compete with what China does, and I think they've been slower to adapt to this than, say, Japan has. There is also, as Dan suggests, some understandable resistance to any notion that we should be trying to out-China China. Clearly is not what we have thought of as good development policy, and we still don't. And I think resistance to what Dan also describes at the end of his book as a mindlessly competitive strategy of attempting to outspend China in every country. But I think in both the EU and the US, what China's been doing in recent years with the BRI and other efforts has resonated as kind of a critique too. But whatever is problematic about it, China was also responding to genuine needs and asks from countries to which we had been, to varying degrees, less responsive than we should have been, and that we at least need to rebalance our approach somewhat. Now, to kind of wrap up, there have been some US-EU attempts to coordinate efforts in this area, but they've been limited essentially by the poor transatlantic relationship in the last few years and the fact that the EU has been so slow to get its own connectivity initiative moving seriously, even though the kind of models that are being discussed on the two sides, the kind of private sector guarantees type model that's likely to emerge, embodied on the US side by the BUILD Act and the International Development Finance Corporation, is actually very similar. I think depending on the election results next week, this is likely to be one of the biggest areas of potential cooperation between the US and Europe on the China agenda. Certainly the broader set of strategic economic challenges that the two sides have with China, but also specifically, what is the overall collective package from like-minded actors that's offered to some of these countries? Not just infrastructure finance, although that's certainly part of it, but also trade, role in supply chains, technology cooperation, and so on. I think there is going to be a real question of geographic focus. My assumption is still that the US will lean a bit more on the maritime side for this kind of competitive piece than towards continental Eurasia. For Europe, though, this is its backyard, and I think it's quite clear that it sees that it can't really afford to completely abdicate on system competition with China here. Either way, I think this is going to form part of what I think is going to be a far more expansive transatlantic burden sharing discussion than we've had in the past. And I think as well that everyone should read Dan's book to help them think this agenda through. And I'll wrap up there.
Wow, excellent. Thank you so much. Dan, do you want to react to that? And I want to invite also our viewers to post questions.
Great, Nargis. Yeah, I'll keep my reaction very brief, only to say that actually, as I thought about the book after it was released, one of the things that I was hoping was that people might see it as a useful framework for kind of extending our understanding of the regional dynamics in other places and thinking about how to best understand what China is up to. And so Andrew's done, in a very short period of time, done a really good job of thinking that issue through in the European context and giving us some clues as to the types of things we should actually be looking at, which have really shaped China's involvement and also give us a better understanding of the reality, on the ground reality of China's investment and involvement in Europe, because otherwise we have a tendency maybe to either overstate it in ways that just aren't reflected by the numbers, or to miss areas of convergence in terms of policy across Europe, as he was describing on critical responses to China. There's actually a reasonable amount of consensus that's emerging rather than a differentiation of views. And I just wanted to add one last piece, which is he talked about, I think quite rightly, about how the US-Europe relationship, transatlantic partnership really should be and is likely to be, especially in a Biden administration, at the core of both sides' response to China. And that really deserves greater highlighting, because this has been the missing piece, or an enormous missing piece, among others, with the Trump administration. The go it alone approach, the kind of America first model, just doesn't work when you're thinking about issues like a global response to China and Chinese standards in technology, or Chinese challenges to multilateral institutional settings and things like that, where norms need to be defended not just by an American voice or just by a European voice, but a more united voice. That makes those ideas, interests, and institutions, and even, at a very basic level, things like technological or IT standards, where there may be a European model and a Chinese model, or an American model and a Chinese model, that gives some strength to our side, which is critically important as we go forward. So again, thanks to Andrew, great thoughts, and really all I wanted to do was highlight bits and pieces of them.
Thank you very much. Well, it seems we are talking about kind of two areas, the Indo-Pacific and Eurasia, so which sort of corresponds to the maritime route and the land bridge. I was wondering what's your take on the kind of tailoring these approaches, both the US and the EU are developing these approaches, as you mentioned, and there was the US has the Indo-Pacific strategy, and Germany just published its own Indo-Pacific strategy, which seems to indicate the kind of emerging consensus on the approaches, but do you see kind of a similar emerging consensus on China in Eurasia? Because, well, there is an opinion that the Eurasia is less conflict prone than the Indo-Pacific, so it might be easier for EU to cooperate with China in Eurasia, and maybe for US as well. And it's sort of can be a laboratory for this kind of growing, of making a new arrangement between these great powers. I don't know if I made myself clear, but basically, can we talk about two big strategies or not?
Yeah, Nargis, I don't know if you wanted that to go to Andrew first, but I can jump in just on a couple of pieces, and then I'll be curious to hear, because I know less about the European Indo-Pacific strategy, and I think he's been following that more closely. But I will say that, you know, for someone like me who's spent the last, I don't know, 6 years writing a book about continental Eurasia, you might think that my reaction would be to say, you know, this is the heartland of the world, and that strategically it is imperative for the United States to focus its principal interest on that heartland, to take a kind of a Mackinder view of things. But in fact, I didn't arrive at that conclusion. I think that the United States has already established its core interests, but also relationships along the periphery of that heartland, whether it's in Western Europe or in East Asia, where our treaty partners and treaty allies are critically important to us. And we also should play to our strengths. And we have spent decades developing the world, the most powerful naval capacity in sort of in defense of a maritime trading regime and infrastructure that already exists that drives the global economy. And we can't lose sight of that. So when we think about where our interests, that is US interests, really lie, they are still in the maritime space. So what that leaves me with is to say, yes, I agree with the notion that it is possible that parts of continental Eurasia may be an area where, when we talk about competition with China, but with pieces of cooperation, this may still be a venue where we ought to be exploring those opportunities for cooperation, even if it's tactical, even if it's narrow, even if it's to avoid worse things happening, say a war between India and Pakistan. This is an area where we should be looking to try to improve our crisis management capabilities with the Chinese. This is not, you know, neither of us disagree about the danger associated with nuclear war between India and Pakistan. We ought to do something more about that. However, last point would be, there is a kind of a short, medium, long-term storyline here. And if over the medium and long term, we begin to see that continental Eurasia is really becoming for China a heartland sphere of influence, where US access is increasingly limited, then that will have consequences for China's ability. And again, this is long-term, we're talking decades, not next year or even a couple of years. But that would create an opportunity for China to place pressure, even military pressure, and certainly political pressure on Western Europe in ways that we have never really contemplated before. And that should be something that we continue to think about. Much of the burden in the short and medium term certainly will fall on the Europeans themselves. But we ought to be at least keeping that on our radar from a US perspective as well, because we can't assume that cooperation in continental Eurasia and competition in the maritime Indo-Pacific will be the reality from here forever. We have to worry about kind of do both at the same time. But I think in the near term, our focus really needs to be, particularly on the security front in the Indo-Pacific.
Mm-hmm. And the competition over norms and standards that you mentioned, how important is Heartland for that?
Well, I think that that's a global story. That's not a geographic story. That's increasingly a story that's in multilateral settings where, our strength, that is the US strength, really ought to be, but it hasn't been in the Trump administration, our emphasis, our ability to leverage our position in major multilateral institutions, which we helped to found. We have a huge investment over decades in building these things. We should see them as actually playing to our enlightened self-interest and not something that's just a drain on our resources.
Great, thank you. Andrew, well, Eurasia is your home turf, or maybe closer to your home turf. What's your take on it?
So I make a couple of points. First of all, this debate kind of mirrors the debate that was going on in China itself when the Belt and Road, and before the Belt and Road, all of the discussions, which Dan also covers in his book very well. One of the debates that I always found very striking was when you had people like Wang Jise and his forerunners, and there's plenty of people who kind of claim ownership of the whole thing, essentially arguing about this march west and Eurasian turn and things like that. The part of the argument was that the US would be less resistant to China expanding its role in continental Eurasia, particularly after the drawdown from Afghanistan, and then the kind of the diminished need for instance, logistical supply routes through Central Asia, all of these things, and even on a longer arc, the US drawdown in the Middle East as well. I mean, certainly the Greater Middle East, and that there would be that it would be viewed not necessarily positively, but more neutrally if China stepped up its role in some of these regions. And part of the argument was that at the same time, these were going to be dynamic markets or could be turned into them, and that there were real opportunities for China there. And part of the internal pushback was, no, these are liabilities. Continental Eurasia is a trap. And there were people, including the PLA Navy and others, who said, no, absolutely not. We really need to be prioritizing the maritime space. This is where the real battles that will play out on everything. I mean, this is the economically richest part, but it's also where the most important strategic battleground is. And everything ended up being kind of blobbed together. So we ended up with a belt and a road and the maritime and the continental. And you didn't have this kind of differentiated strategy of the sort that some of the thinkers on the Chinese had initially been advocating. But I don't think that question has gone away either on the Chinese side or on the external debates about how we respond to this. There is still a serious question about whether, in fact, it may prove to be a greater liability if China is more deeply involved in some of these environments. Therefore, if you're picking places where China, you might decide that this is not an area to compete with China quite as forcefully, name your country and location, but Afghanistan is one of the obvious focal points for that. It might be better if China steps up its role there and takes on some of those responsibilities. The scenarios that Dan talks about, in which we reach a situation in which instead we're dealing with a thriving set of commercial trade routes, booming markets and things, one can sort of step back in as it seems that this is the direction that things are headed, but then almost leave China to deal with the consequences in the near term. And that, I think, is the sort of benign neglect scenario that Dan almost explores in one of the chapters of the book. Now, for Europe, there are parts of this where this is impossible. I mean, it's impossible to consider this when you're talking about countries and regions that abut the EU, but wider Europe itself. And so this is not an option in a certain sense when you're talking about a series of locations on Europe's immediate periphery, where it will make a tremendous difference if China extends its economic, technological, and political influence. And the steps that need to be taken are steps that are being kind of taken immediately. I mean, most obviously, if you come very close, the Western Balkans and things like that. But even when we're talking now about reshoring and supply chain rebalancing and nearshoring and things like that, it means you can't afford to have a certain kind of Chinese role in the Middle East and North Africa looking over time. And you have to figure out ways to kind of step in and push back. And precisely for the reasons that you mentioned, Nargis, on the kind of the values and ideological piece is deeply intertwined with even the economic piece. It will make a difference what landscape emerges in the European periphery if you have a certain form of Chinese economic presence, and a certain form of political presence will translate in ways that have economic implications for Europe as well. So I think on some of these issues, and this is why I again kind of mentioned the burden sharing thing on this, I think there are going to be areas where the US says, actually for us, this is still our priority. Some of these specific locations, however, are going to be areas where Europe will have to step up more actively. And I think is aware that it needs to do that in a more focused way, even for countries that are as close to Europe and are accession candidates and things like Serbia. And so I think the map of the countries and priorities is going to differ. But I mean, I won't go into the Indo-Pacific piece. We're still in early stages, I think, on the European strategy there. There is more alignment in views, certainly. I think the fact that Germany issued it, we're going to get an EU strategy probably on the Indo-Pacific as well. It's not just about the US. Japan, of course, came out with this even before that. Australia came out with it beforehand. I think this conceptual framework is something that Europe is increasingly comfortable with as well. And this will be a structure through which a lot of cooperation can take place transatlantically and with Asia, with partners across the region, across the Indo-Pacific. But I think a heavy responsibility will also, as usual, fall on Europe for it's nearer abroad, even if the US decides in practice that in some of these places, it doesn't make sense to have these as focal points for competition.
Okay, very interesting. And on that Germany strategy, I was, well, I was a bit surprised that it didn't refer to the Blue Dot network. It talks about, you know, connectivity. Well, obviously the rules-based connectivity, sustainable, and all that. And well, of course, it talks about the EU-Japan partnership for quality infrastructure, but it doesn't mention Blue Dot network, which I wonder, you know, why there is no mention of that. But I don't know if you have anything to.
I mean, super briefly on this. I mean, there have been, this is a natural area of cooperation between the US and Europe, and then there have been some unhelpful obstacles to doing this that have not reflected a lot of the thinking that's gone on the US side in this administration on all of these initiatives. Anything with the Build Act piece, the new development finance instruments, the Blue Dot initiative, these are all good. I mean, that's really not been the obstacle. I don't think these things are seen critically on the European side. I think these are all areas in which, within a matter of a couple of months, we should be in a different place on things. It's been other political disputes that have had a kind of unhelpful, kind of pernicious effect on the scope to have the level of cooperation in these areas that we should. And I think, as I said again, Europe's been slow on this. I mean, the fact we're getting to an Indo-Pacific strategy, we will get to something where the ideas and thinking that have taken place on connectivity on the European side should, I hope, start translating into effect by the end of this German EU presidency. But we're not there yet. It's really lagged behind. It hasn't been as much of a priority until now for the new, well, it's newish now European Commission. And I think that will be fixed in the next period of time. I think it will be fixed in a way that means that some of these initiatives where it's just obvious that the two sides could partner more effectively, that will look politically easier in some circumstances than in others. I think it should still be possible if Trump is re-elected and people get their you know, there's still convergence on these areas regardless, but there are certain, you know, different kinds of transatlantic political obstacles there, particularly I would say in Berlin, but to a certain extent in Brussels.
Dan, do you have thoughts on this?
I have nothing on the Blue Dot in Germany, but I had one thought related that may be useful for a Davis Center audience in particular. You know, look, one of the things we've just done is we've shifted our analysis as we've been talking, and I think rightly in a way, to what the United States ought to do and what Europe ought to do. But yet again, we're playing this region of continental Eurasia as a kind of a target for external powers and as a competitive playing ground for their agendas. And to some extent, of course, that's true. But I think we ought to be, recognizing that critically important to how China's role evolves in this region would be, what does Russia do? And the nature of the Europe-Russia and US-Russia relationship so far has probably been the principal driver that has brought Russia and China closer together. Without assigning fault or anything, we just have to look analytically at what are the dynamics at play. And it's Russia's negative reaction to the United States, or our negative reaction to Russia. The tensions there drive Russia into China's sphere and create a Russia that is much less likely to push back against Chinese influence in parts of continental Eurasia than we could imagine it would otherwise be. And if that persists, if that trend persists, then it really will be on the shoulders of the Europeans, and to, I think, a lesser extent, the United States, to be playing this game of trying to compete for Chinese influence in continental Eurasia. But if we were to imagine, again, over time, a Russia that itself was increasingly jealous of China, concerned about China's influence, then that too would be a natural, you might say, antibody or obstacle to Chinese influence, would actually make Europe's life easier, at least in the narrow sense, of having to confront a Chinese competition in its own backyard.
And actually, we did get a question about Russia, and Russia's role in all this. Andrew, do you have thoughts on Russia?
I mean, the opposite is also true. I mean, I'll see what the question is. I mean, when take like the Ukraine crisis, I mean, the annexation of Crimea, to take an obvious case. I mean, some of the question at that stage was, is it helpful in the grand scheme of things from a European perspective that you do have an increase in Chinese economic presence in Ukraine itself, but looking at some of these Belt and Road initiatives, because actually the priority is for some of these countries to a more kind of balanced and independent and sovereign situation will mean that they have a balanced set of partners. It's not necessarily, and that in certain locations means rebalancing away from Russia. And if that's rebalancing away from Russia, partly in a way that means that China's own economic role is increased, maybe that's not such a bad thing. And there was, I think, some quite significant debates on this back during that period of time. I'd say the view has probably shifted on that, partly because of the Sino-Russian relationship moving in the direction that it has post-Crimea, but also because I think you've had this much more sort of concerted agenda to do this kind of locking in of standards and norms and technology and things like that in ways that go in some ways beyond what the Russian economic influence amounted to. There was a sort of the teleology of it looked different. In the end, I think there was still a faith that over time, as the country's economies advanced, they would end up gravitating towards Europe or the West more broadly. The teleology for China is actually that there's a form of lock-in financially, technologically, and other ways there that was just never going to be possible in the same way with Russia. And I think that has kind of shifted thinking in terms of what forms of competition are going to be necessary in some of these areas if you're not going to have at least kind of on some key elements that are first an economic battleground, but on the technological side, how far this locks in also some of precisely the norms and principles that one was worried about in a Russia context as well, how far China simply augments that. And so I think on the European side, I think the thinking has moved towards seeing almost all of this in a more competitive space with China than was the case, certainly 10 years ago, 5 years ago, when it came to analyzing these questions.
Right. But of course, there is a question, what kind of resources need to be allocated for kind of staying on top and spreading your norms and standards. Because if you learn anything from BRI is that kind of throwing money at it doesn't give you always an advantage. So yes. Okay, there was a question about the maritime space. Given that it's potentially harder to govern than land, how should the world superpowers view this fluid maritime space in terms of ownership or responsibilities? Well, that's a big question, and we have like 6 minutes. If you could briefly, if any of you could briefly address that.
It is a huge question.
It's a huge question, yes.
I think to begin to approach it, I would start at least with the recognition that the maritime space is one in which the United States and its partners have actually invested a great deal in not so much governance, because that's not really the point, but maintaining security and stability over, again, decades, in the form both of the practical physical requirements in terms of maintaining lines of communication in areas that have been harmed or threatened by piracy or other security threats, as well as establishing rules of the road for what it means to operate at sea, for commerce and so on. These things have been, an enormous amount of time and energy and investment has gone into this, and it has been remarkably successful. It's one of the, the signature successes of the modern era to see global trade. So I don't know, 90% of global trade passing in these ways by sea, and that should persist. The challenge to this, of course, really comes from in part now, especially from China, where some of the rules of the road are being contested, and in places like the South China Sea and elsewhere. But the solution to that problem is, as I said earlier, not to go it alone, but to reinvest or double down on the processes and institutions that have worked in the past. And to, I think everything that we've said so far, everything that Andrew said and that I've said so far really has reinforced the notion that the principal question for US policymakers going forward and for the upcoming election is whether the future looks, in a sense, more to the past for inspiration, that is, an investment in a kind of a liberal order and ordering principles and defending that liberal order, possibly having to work harder to do so in the face of a Chinese challenge, as well as other challenges, or whether it looks like the a trajectory of a severe breakdown in that order, in which case many of our assumptions, including about maritime trade and all of the pieces that go along with this, will begin to break down even further than they have. And that's why so many people are so exercised over this election, because they really appreciate just how central some of those decisions coming out of Washington will be, even over the next 4 years.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Andrew? Maybe on this liberal order, I think we're finishing quite well. What will be the place for China in this liberal world order if we manage, if US, EU, and like-minded partners can manage to build it? What are the prospects?
I mean, the question at the moment is also, are you constructing essentially a refreshed parallel order between a whole series of like-minded states that kind of, you continue to fight in the multilateral space, but you also construct a channel a lot more energy into the kind of plurilateral space, like-minded groupings and things, whether it's trade cooperation, technology cooperation, a whole series of new institutions or strengthening of existing institutions that are created. We've channeled in the last period of time a prodigious amount of energy into the bilateral relationship with China. If you look at the old strategic and economic dialogue, you would virtually, prodigious numbers of officials that would go over to China and try and figure out, how can we fit together our agendas. We did not channel the same level of energy into coordination between partners on this entire set of questions. I think in the next period of time and with the next administration, I think you are going to see that kind of qualitative shift. This administration has effectively, as Dan said, pursued a lot of its China agenda unilaterally. I think one of the big rebalancing elements in that will be a much more ally-centric approach, but that's going to mean a lot more diplomatic, political, and institutional energy that also goes into that kind of parallel space between allies and partners in a way that is partly it is not the same thing as the version of a kind of global liberal order as what had been envisaged before. I think there is a sense that some of that is not what might have been hoped for from China in that respect is not going to be possible. You hope that by constructing these coalitions, it will also push China to change its own approach. But if it doesn't, then we need to have systems that are resilient enough to deal with that.
Very interesting. And of course, that leaves us with the question, you know, what are the options for small countries like Kazakhstan? And our time is up. Let me thank you. Thank our wonderful speakers. Thank you very much, Dan, for your great book. And thank you very much, Andrew, for joining us and giving your insights. And I would like to thank the audience